"It's a fairy stone!" she cried excitedly. "Why, where on earth did you—" "Why, Sister Sally told me about 'em. She said folks found 'em everywhere over here in Virginia, and all her life she was a wishin' for one, and she could never get it." Her eyes filled. "Seems like everything she wanted is a comin' to me." "Do you know the story of it, too?" asked Hale. June shook her head. "Sister Sally said it was a luck piece. Nothin' could happen to you when you carried it, but I was awful bad luck if you lost it." Hale put it around her neck and fastened the clasp, and June kept hold of the little cross with one hand. "Well, you mustn't lose it," he said. "Oh, no, no," she repeated breathlessly, and Hale told her the pretty story of the stone as they strolled back to supper. The little crosses were to be found only in a certain valley in Virginia, so perfect in shape that they seemed to have been chiseled by hand, and they were a great mystery to the men who knew all about rocks, the geologists. "The geologists," repeated June. "These men said there was no crystallization, nothing like them," amended Hale, "elsewhere in the world, and that just as crosses were as different of shapes, Roman, Maltese, and St. Andrew's, so, too, these crosses were found in all these different shapes, and the myth, the story, was that this little valley was once inhabited by fairies." June's eyes lighted, for it was a fairy story after all, and that when a strange messenger brought them the news of Christ's crucifixion they wept, and their tears as they fell to the ground were turned into tiny crosses of stone. Even the Indians had some queer feeling about them, and for a long, long time people who found them had used them as charms to bring good luck and ward off harm. "And that's for you," he said, "because you've been such a good little girl and have studied so hard. School's most over now, and I reckon you'll be right glad to get home again." June made no answer, but at the gate she looked suddenly up at him. "Hey, have you got one, too?" she asked, and she seemed much disturbed when Hale shook his head. "Well, I'll get you one some day." "All right," laughed Hale. There was again something strange in her manner as she turned suddenly from him, and what it meant he was soon to learn. It was the last week of school, and Hale had just come down from the woods behind the schoolhouse at little recess time in the afternoon. The children were playing games outside the gate, and Bob and Miss Anne and the little Professor were leaning on the fence watching them. The little man raised his hand to halt Hale on the plank sidewalk. "Been waiting to see you," he said in his dreamy, abstracted way. "You prophesied, you know, that I should be proud of your little protege some day, and I am indeed. She is the most remarkable pupil I've yet seen here, and I have about come to the conclusion that there is no quicker native intelligence in our country than you shall find in the children of these mountaineers, and—" Miss Anne was gazing at the children with an expression that turned Hale's eyes that way, and the Professor checked his harangue. Something had happened. They had been playing Ring Around the Rosy, and June had been caught. She stood scarlet and tense, and the cry was, "Who's your beau? Who's your beau?" And still she stood with tight lips, flushing. "You got to tell, you got to tell." The mountain boy, Cal Heaton, was grinning with facetious consciousness, and even Bob put his hands in his pockets and took on an uneasy smile. "Who's your beau?" came the chorus again. The lips opened almost in a whisper, but all could hear. "Jack." "Jack who?" But June looked around and saw the four at the gate. Almost staggering, she broke from the crowd and, with one forearm across her scarlet face, rushed past them into the schoolhouse. Miss Anne looked at Hale's amazed face, and she did not smile. Bob turned respectfully away, ignoring it all, and the little Professor, whose life purpose was psychology, murmured in his ignorance, "Very remarkable, very remarkable." Through that afternoon June kept her hot face close to her books. Bob never so much as glanced her way, little gentleman that he was, but the one time she lifted her eyes, she met the mountain lad's bent in a stupor gaze upon her. In spite of her apparent studiousness, however, she missed her lesson, and automatically the little Professor told her to stay in after school and recite to Miss Saunders, and so June and Miss Anne sat in the school room alone, the teacher reading a book and the pupil, her tears unshed, with her sullen face bent over her lesson. In a few moments the door opened and the little Professor thrust in his head. The girl had looked so hurt and tired when he spoke to her that some strange sympathy moved him, mystified though he was, to say gently now, and with a warm smile that was rare with him, "You might excuse June, I think, Miss Saunders, and let her recite some time tomorrow." And gently he closed the door. Miss Anne rose. "Very well, June," she said quietly. June rose too, gathering up her books, and as she passed the teacher's platform, she stopped and looked her full in the face. She said not a word, and the tragedy between the woman and the girl was played in silence, for the woman knew from the searching gaze of the girl and the black defiance in her eyes as she stalked out of the room that her own flush had betrayed her secret as plainly as the girl's words had told hers. Through his office window a few minutes later Hale saw June pass swiftly into the house. In a few minutes she came swiftly out again and went back swiftly towards the schoolhouse. He was so worried by the tense look in her face that he could work no more, and in a few minutes he threw his papers down and followed her. When he turned the corner, Bob was coming down the street with his cap on the back of his head and swinging his books by a strap, and the boy looked a little conscious when he saw Hale coming. "Have you seen June?" Hale asked. "No, sir," said Bob, immensely relieved. "Did she come up this way?" "I don't know, but—" Bob turned and pointed to the green dome of a big beech. "Think you'll find her at the foot of that tree," he said. "That's where her playhouse is, and that's where she goes when that's where she usually goes." "Oh, yes," said Hale, "her playhouse. Thank you." "Not at all, sir." Hale went on, turned from the path, and climbed noiselessly. When he caught sight of the beech, he stopped still. June stood against it like a wood nymph just emerged from its sun-dappled trunk, stood stretched to her full height, her hands behind her, her hair tossed, her throat tense under the dangling little cross, her face uplifted. At her feet the playhouse was scattered to pieces. She seemed listening to the love calls of a wood thrush that came faintly through the still woods, and then he saw that she heard nothing, saw nothing, that she was in a dream as deep as sleep. Hale's heart throbbed as he looked. "June!" he called softly. She did not hear him, and when he called again, she turned her face, unstartled, and moving her posture not at all. Hale pointed to the scattered playhouse. "I done it," she said fiercely. "I done it myself." Her eyes burned steadily into his even while she lifted her hands to her hair as though she were only vaguely conscious that it was all undone. "You heard me," she cried, and before he could answer, "She heard me." And again, not waiting for a word from him, she cried still more fiercely, I don't care who knows." Her hands were trembling, she was biting her quivering lip to keep back the starting tears, and Hale rushed toward her and took her in his arms. "June, June," he said brokenly, "you mustn't, little girl. I'm proud, why, little sweetheart." She was clinging to him and looking up into his eyes, and he bent his head slowly. Their lips met, and the man was startled. He knew now it was no child that answered him. Hale walked long that night in the moonlit woods, up and around Imboden Hill, along a shallow, haunted path, between silvery beech trunks, past the big hole in the earth from which dead trees tossed out their crooked arms as if in torment, and to the top of the ridge under which the valley slept, and above which the dark bulk of Powell's Mountain rose. It was absurd, but he found himself strangely stirred. She was a child, he kept repeating to himself, in spite of the fact that he knew she was no child among her own people, and that mountain girls were even wives who were younger still. Still, she did not know what she felt. How could she? And she would get over it. And then came the sharp stab of a doubt. Would he want her to get over it? Frankly and with wonder he confessed to himself that he did not know. He did not know. But again, why bother? He had meant to educate her anyhow. That was the first step. No matter what happened, June must go out into the world, to school. He would have plenty of money. Her father would not object, and June need never know. He could include for her an interest in her own father's coal lands that he meant to buy, and she could